What do Unitarian Universalists believe? We're going to explore this question using the framework suggested by retired UU minister, Reverend Fred Campbell. Some of you may recognize this name, as Reverend Campbell was once an interim minister for our congregation. Reverend Campbell suggests that UUs fall into one of four groups: humanists, naturalists, mystics, and theists. Actually, this sounds like an opening for a joke where four UUs walk into a bar. Rather than give away the punchline, I'll let our four speakers share their ideas with you. First is longtime member Ron Kroll, who will share his thoughts on humanism.
Well, that took about my 4 minutes to get here. Reverend Campbell defines humanism as a school of thought that quote, finds life's meaning within the human community, past, present, and future. This is to say that the why of life, the transcendent, resides in our human capacity to think, create, understand, and change, unquote. This is a very broad definition and probably says it all that is needed to say. But for those of us who call ourselves humanists, there are other aspects of our life and the way we think and feel and interact. For those of us in the UU community, we are guided by our principles. And that is true for me as a humanist, as I'm sure it's true for most people in the other three groups. However, as I reflect on the sources from which our principles derive, it is the humanist tradition that speaks to me the most, and the way I think and feel. And I'm going to read this out of our hymnal. Quote, "The living tradition that we share draws from many sources. One is humanist teachings which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. In my 5 minutes, I want to talk about and reflect on other aspects of humanism, which I think define me as a humanist. One, I am committed to the application of science and reason to our future and to the solution of human problems. I believe in science and reason very strongly. Two, I'm concerned about social justice and fairness in society, including supporting racial equality and sexual orientation. Three, the beloved community, as I've come to understand it, is very much a part of my humanist belief. That no matter who we are, we strive to support each other and to work together for the good of us all, as well as the good of all humanity. Four, nothing is more essential to humanism than truth. Truth, to me, truth matters. Most of the issues and actions we are confronted with daily need to be examined, even if unconsciously, for truthfulness. I think anyone who has a humanistic values has to be skeptical of lots of untested claims that are out there today. Not only the obvious things like ads and politics, but many of the other issues and principles that we hold dear need to be examined for truthfulness. And truth now is really under sustained assault from lots of angles. As Tom Hartman says, we have a coming onslaught of disinformation for the rest of 23 and 24, but that gets to politics, which is not what I'm talking about today. 5, as a humanist, I reject a God figure, but I do think religion plays an important part in my understanding of morality and ethics. I have to get a little academic here. If you are reading or thinking about humanism, you'll often read about secular humanism, which I'm not a secular humanist. Secular humanism is a philosophy, to quote, secular humanism is a philosophy and a belief system or life stance that embraces human reason, secular ethics, and philosophical naturalism. That's a pretty broad thing. While rejecting the religious dogma and supernaturalism as the basis of morality and decision-making. Secular humanism posits that human beings are capable of being ethical and moral without religion or any kind of belief in a deity. Secular humanism posits that people can be moral without a religion of any kind. As I said, I'm not a secular humanist. I don't believe in a God figure, but I do know that religion and this church plays a central role for me as a person who is really trying to be moral and ethical. It is not whether I need to be religious, but how I need to be religious. Another belief that I have as a humanist is that I'm committed to the separation of church and state. I take a magazine which informs most of my beliefs. It's called Church and State, which I read regularly. I take a couple of magazines besides that one. It's a publication of the Americans United for Church and State. Their tagline is "One Nation, All Beliefs," instead of "One Nation under God." And they add equality without exception. 7, I think I affirm being a humanist as I get satisfaction in the service of others. For example, Nancy and Kathy Hayes and Mike Graham and I, with the help of Miriam, of course, worked our UUC table for several hours yesterday at the Suicide Prevention Walk, which gathered in Bronson Park. And last, let me make one more statement without comment. I think being a humanist helps you confront death with some serenity. Lastly, I take another magazine, which is important to my thinking. It's called Free Inquiry. I'll put a copy back there. Free Inquiry prints out on the inside front cover of each issue a set of beliefs and necessary actions that they call the affirmation of humanism, a set of principles. I made a few copies and put it back there. I've only dealt with my beliefs. A couple of those principles is, you're lucky I didn't take time to do all 21. So let me finish by noting that my sense of being as a humanist takes me back to our principles. I truly accept the worth and dignity of everyone. People matter to me as I live my life. I'm concerned about the well-being of others, and nothing is more essential to humanism than truth. To me, truth matters. Now I'd like to introduce David Senegal to talk about deism, wherever you are. There you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. This is exciting because I think it sounds to me like a lot of our thoughts and ideas are going to intersect with each other among the four of us. And also that's why I was so close behind you, because I don't want to take 4 minutes to get up here either, which these days is a definite possibility. Well, Joe Calmy tells me that I am not the only person to come up to this podium with a Bible in my hand. So I thought, oh, gee, maybe I'm going to be the first one, but that's not what he said. Okay, Reverend Campbell says that theists, in his words, know that God exists, and their values derive from this knowing and this relationship. But what kind of God can we, as Unitarian Universalists, responsibly embrace in this way? I'm not really sure that I'm going to be answering his questions because the title of my message is God Talk, Random Thoughts on Wrestling with the Divine. And the word theist strikes me as a bit dry, and then I thought I started out with deity, and then I thought, no, the divine fits me better. So it was kind of a shock when I started to, put my thoughts together. because I thought back to my earliest years as far as I could remember. I was born in 1940. I do not remember the first 10 years of my life or so, my parents, my grandparents, or anybody talking about God. I just have no remembrance of it at all. I remember my mom sending me, and I think it was my sister, to a Protestant church just down the block from us. I don't know how old we were then, to go to Sunday school, and that did not last very long because I remember hardly anything about it. So my introduction to God comes from the Roman Catholic Church around 1950 in Muskegon, where I'm from. The Diocese of Grand Rapids decided to build a new church because there were several Catholic churches in the Muskegon area that were very old, and they usually were ethnically connected, you know, Italians, French Canadians, Polish. And it was the baby boom era, and there were a lot of young families with little kids. So my parents and my grandparents and several of my extended family joined this church, St. Francis de Sales, which is still there 75 years later. And they needed altar boys for the Mass, or acolytes as we call them nowadays. And of course, the Mass was in Latin back in those days. So we had to train the boys, you know, to assist the priest at the Mass. So the beginning of the Latin Mass then was called the introit, and it comes from the Latin word introibo. Introibo ad altare Dei, qui Deum qui laetificat juventutem meam. That was the response, and that's what the altar boy said. And that was my introduction to God in the Latin language. So, and the words are so apt, because I will enter under the altar of God, and God gives joy to my youth. Yeah, there was a lot of joy in my entering into Catholic culture. And I just ate it up, which led to, I only went to 1 year of parochial high school, you know, Catholic Central High School in Muskegon, and joyfully started to seriously study the Latin language, because I didn't, those responses, I didn't really know what they meant. Deum, that's God, you know. So, and my sister Euphemia was my teacher, you know, wonderful Dominican nun, taught me Latin. Then a cousin of mine and a member from a very large family went to the seminary. In those days, the Catholic Church had what they called minor seminaries, what there really were prep schools to produce Catholic laymen, because the attrition rate was very high, like about 90%. But I felt called to do that, and I talked to my parents and letting me go. And that was a wonderful education. And that introduced me to one of the passions in my life, which has persisted to this day, which was opera. Our choir director was an opera fanatic, and he introduced me to it, and it's stuck with me ever since. It was my entree to theater and music performance, which came much later on for me. Well, I'll talk about that later on. So I eventually left the seminary because of course, one of the vows that the priest has to take, this is the Franciscan order, by the way, founded by St. Francis of Assisi, and our poverty, chastity, and obedience. And the chastity thing was really hard for me. I could not see myself being celibate for the rest of my life. So I decided to enter back into a broader society. And I eventually ended up at St. Thomas More Church at Western. And by then, Vatican II had happened, you know, the council which changed the Mass to the vernacular language, whatever country it happened to be in, which took a lot of adjustment, and some there was less mystery to it than the Mass being in Latin, but that was fine. So later, I was married and then divorced, and then that was a totally new life for me. And that's when I became involved in theater and music performance. Great passions, which I don't really do much theater anymore. My last show was here, as a matter of fact. But those passions were the closest to heaven that I have ever become. I really have to say that. And I couldn't get away from the divine because this is just a little list of the roles, some of the roles I was performing in plays and musical theater. Jesus, yes. One or more of his disciples, Herod, Pilate, Caiaphas the high priest, a Franciscan friar. So I went back to that, even though I didn't stay in the seminary. A seminary student who was also an amateur cellist, and a nun. I don't have time to tell you about that experience, but yes, I actually played a nun in a play. So I was unchurched for 12 years. The theater and music took its place until, and again, it was music that drew me back to the church because I went to St. Martin of Tours Episcopal Church. The reason for that was one of my colleagues from the library where I spent my entire career was the organist there, and I had never heard him play. And he said, "Oh, why don't you come over and to a service and hear me play?" And I did, and then I ended up staying for 28 years. So it was music there because I was an enthusiastic member of the choir. And the great thing about St. Martin's was it was under, they had a great pastor there for 16 years, but he was very traditional. It was time for a big change. And our pastor came in, who was still there, was very much an activist, to the point that that church became a model for the entire diocese. However, a bête noire, to use a fancy word, which literally in French means black beast, a stumbling block came into my life while I was at St. Martin's, and I don't exactly know when it happened, but it persisted for over 10 years. I started to really take a look at those words, Credo in unum Deum Patrum omnipotentem. I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, et cetera, et cetera. And I started to have doubts. I mean, not just fleeting doubts, very serious and disturbing doubts, which went on for 10 years. So eventually, I found my way to this church. I don't want to go into too long about that. Starting in November of 2019. And it turned out to be what I call the 3 R's, a retreat from my previous beliefs, a chance to react to them often negatively. And I find myself having pretty much dispelled that kind of thing at this point, just to rest from God and to restore and to nurture, my belief, my future beliefs, whatever they might be. So that's what happened at this church. And also during that time, and this is fairly recent, I became a student of Stoic philosophy, which to me, I've spoken from this podium before about that, but to me, it goes hand in hand with most of the UU principles. UU principles, I think, take a global point of view, but Stoicism very much provides, for me anyway, a blueprint for daily living. So to close in my wrestling match with the divine, in some ways I am still pinned to the mat. I've read that Stoic philosophers love wrestling metaphors. So I offer some brief excerpts from the prophet Micah, who lived some 700 years before the Christian era, in the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament, and John the evangelist, the beloved of Jesus, in his first epistle or letter and gospel. A prophet and a writer who are much stronger and more articulate than I, whose words still speak to me across the millennia. So this is from Micah. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. Your God, I emphasize. And then I think from John in his epistle. This will sound very familiar to you. God is love. Whoever abides in love abides in God, and God in them. A hymn we used to sing at St. Martin's all the time. Or you can use abides too, that's probably more familiar too. God is love, whoever abides in love abides in God, and God in them. And then, I forgot to mention the reading from Micah. Those words have been set to a very beautiful song by the composer Antonin Dvorak, which I sang as a solo at St. Martin's a couple of times, I think. If you ever want to check on YouTube or any place such, you can probably find a recording of it. It's definitely worth listening to. And finally, this is from John the Evangelist, Jesus with Pilate before his crucifixion. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea," Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then?" said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. I love that word, retorted. It's not just replied or asked. Retort is kind of a sharp rebuke. If I were Jesus, I might have said, "Find out for yourself, Pontius P. What is truth?" So finally, in very simple words, the basic Stoic directive: be true to yourself and others, do the right thing always, and come to acceptance of and to make peace with your death. In our own Unitarian Universalist declaration, we are truth seekers, which I try to follow every day of my life. Next, we'll hear from Eric Nelson on mysticism. Eric couldn't be with us in person, but has recorded his talk, which we'll hear now.
Good morning. This is Eric Nelson, and I'm going to be sharing today a bit of background about mysticism and how it relates to Unitarianism, Unitarian Universalism, as well as my own life. I'll attempt to provide a very brief view of mysticism, and I'll begin with a couple of definitions. This is from St. Teresa, who defines mysticism as a belief in the union with or absorption into a deity or the absolute, and the spiritual apprehension of knowledge that is inaccessible to the intellect, that is obtained through contemplation and self-surrender. Another definition from Webster's: a purportedly non-sensory awareness or a non-structured sensory experience of realities or states of consciousness that are of a kind not accessible by the way of ordinary sense perceptions, mental constructions, or introspection. Now I'll share a little of the history, the roots of mysticism. Mystical experiences seem to be universal within all religions, and probably all primal religions as well. In some traditions, the experiences are allegedly of a supersensory reality, such as God or Brahman. Many Buddhist traditions, however, make no claim for an experience of a supersensory reality, but instead cultivate an experience of unconstructed awareness, involving an awareness of the world at a completely or partially non-conceptual level. This non-conceptual experience is thought to grant knowledge of the true nature of phenomenal reality, such as the impermanent nature of the material world. Researcher Eric Schmidt, a historian of religion, writes, mysticism arrived in the English language in the 18th century as a derogatory term for Christian fanatics. Some critics dismiss mysticism as a minor sect, associating it with Quakers or contemplative French Catholic quietists. Others use the term to describe early Christians' painful bodily exercises. Henry Coventry, an 18th century writer of the English Enlightenment, helped bring mysticism into general usage, and he contrasted mysticism with theology in the following quote. Mysticism opens us to angelic entertainments and ecstasy, compared to religion, which he describes as a liberal, manly, rational, and social institution. Coventry further argued that mystical religious practitioners, especially women, might believe they were passionately devoted to God, but were actually transferring frustrated sexual love onto an imaginal divine object. In fact, he argued sublimated sexuality made up the far greatest part of female religion. A different time. It was only in the middle of the 19th century that Western cultures began using mysticism to describe their own direct efforts to experience the divine. Eric Schmidt's research focused particularly on New England. Ironically, some of the mysticism's greatest advocates were Unitarians, a Protestant denomination closely associated with the kind of liberal rationality Coventry had favored starting in the 1830s. Unitarians associated with the Transcendentalist movement began embracing mysticism. Among them were theologian and abolitionists Theodore Parker, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and feminist journalist Margaret Fuller. This group was eager to try out varied practices from other cultures in the service of a universal spirituality. As Fuller wrote of herself, they were ready to plunge into the sea of Buddhism and mystical experiences. This focus on direct personal experience helped liberal Protestants imagine a future free of sectarianism and, at least in theory, equally open to all world's religions. Unitarian minister Octavius Frontenham declared that mysticism was found equally among Orthodox and heterodox Protestants and Catholics, pagans and Christians, Greeks and Hindus, and people of the world. At a time when scientific rationalism was challenging many religious claims, Schmidt writes, the intuitive, irreducible nature of mystical experience was also an intellectual shield against a purely materialistic worldview. And in closing, I'll just provide just a brief taste of my own journey in mystical and contemplative practices. I've been a spiritual seeker, I would say, since age 12, when I encountered Catholic liberation theology, which emphasized liberation from social, political, and economic oppression as an expression of ultimate liberation. I was especially inspired by the parable of the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament, where Jesus states, love your enemies, forgive others, and care for the poor and marginalized. Jesus emphasized the importance of humility, not to worry about material possessions or outward appearances, but to focus on living a life of righteousness and integrity. This philosophy of life described in the Sermon on the Mount inspired me to seek deeper experiences of the essence of Jesus' teachings. Through serendipity or fate, I was browsing the bookstore or the library at my Catholic church and found a book describing the many paths of Hinduism, especially the yogic practices. The practices that resonated with me the most were the Yoga Sutras, which teach the 8 limbs of yoga that lead to samadhi or self-realization. This book launched me into a lifelong exploration of contemplative practice that included shamanic practices, Hindu practices, and Buddhist practices. Fast forward 50 years and I'm still on the path of connecting to my full capacity as both a personal ego and as a spiritual being, experiencing the infinite range of ways of knowing that, in the words of Gandhi, state, man is the center of a circle without a circumference, except the ones he creates for himself. I'll repeat that. Man, or humanity, is the center of a circle without a circumference, except the ones he creates for himself. Thank you for listening, and I hope these words helped shed some light on the rather elusive topic of mysticism. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Good morning. My name is Joe Kalmy. I'm on the Sunday Services Committee and was involved in organizing this service. It was a little challenging finding speakers, as I think most have some hesitance to check a single box on a form that defines their spiritual beliefs. In fact, nobody answered our call for volunteers, so we simply solicited speakers. And I think we've already heard from people that exemplify or at least sympathize with a particular spiritual belief. The hardest niche to fill turned out to be naturalism, so I volunteered. As I was coordinating this service, I had a little bit of an advantage over the other speakers. I got to choose the order in which we presented our views, so I chose to go last. Originally, I didn't closely identify with the spiritual belief of naturalism. However, the more I thought about it, the better it felt to me. Let me explain. But first, let's see how Reverend Campbell defines naturalism. He says, naturalism is a school of thought that understands that humans are part of the natural world and draws meaning from that context. So that's a pretty broad statement, and it's kind of hard to argue against it. That being said, I think that in a number of ways, naturalism actually encompasses many of the aspects of humanism, mysticism, and theism. Let's start with theism. Like several of you, I grew up in a traditional Christian faith, in my case, Catholicism. Many of the Bible stories I grew up with certainly dealt with our natural world. The Garden of Eden is just one example of nature as a metaphor you can use to draw meaning on the context of good and evil. And we've all heard it said that God is all around us. That is, in the natural world. This reminds me of my evangelical Christian neighbor. I've helped him as he's become interested in becoming a beekeeper. As we were inspecting a hive together, he commented that what we were actually seeing was a miracle of God. So naturalism includes theism. Drifting away from the Catholic Church, my wife and my wife's Methodist tradition came as the next logical step as we had children and wanted to bring them up to be free thinkers. We started attending People's Church and were introduced to humanism. This human community that Reverend Campbell speaks about obviously is part of the natural world. So much of humanism looks for meaning in our relationship with each other and the world we live in. I'm inspired by the leadership provided by many humanists to improve the world we live in today and for the future. An example is environmentalism, which certainly shines bright the value of protecting the natural world. So again, naturalism includes aspects of humanism. As I grew older, I encountered many other spiritual influences, mostly with the help of my wife. But I think even to a bigger influence, it was my mother-in-law, Miriam. She studied a wide range of beliefs that generally fell into the category of mysticism. She saw miracles all around her. She saw God in science. She imagined a world beyond our natural world, but at the same time strongly connected to the reality most of us felt comfortable talking about. We have on occasion connected to this mystical world. We have visited spiritualists who have told us about our past lives. They've told us what colors our auras are and wisdoms of those no longer with us. All of this does tell me that there is a connection between our natural world and something mystical beyond it. So finally, let's talk about naturalism. Let me just say that the most spiritual experience in my whole life happened in nature. It wasn't something I was seeking, it just happened. Back in the 70s, I was on a business trip in Fremont, California. I was gone for a couple weeks, so I had a weekend alone. I had a car since I was working for Chevrolet. I decided to drive across the Golden Gate Bridge. Once across the bridge, I just kept driving for a while. Soon I came upon the entrance to Muir Woods National Monument. I went in and there were very few people around. Of course, the biggest attraction here is the old growth coastal redwood trees towering over 200 feet above us. A short walk and you can be standing alone among these giant trees. Silence is all around. The air is thick with oxygen. The path is soft with ages of redwood needles. And I suddenly felt that I was personally connected to the energy in that wondrous place, as part of something beyond my explanation. I still fondly remember this experience as I'm pruning my grapevines, tending to my beehives, or planting in my gardens. So I guess I really do identify with naturalism. Thank you.
Thank you to our four members for sharing some insights into their spiritual explorations.